Good morning, good afternoon, or good night to any of my listeners wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to another episode of a Canadian Perspectives podcast. I'm your host, Michael Harris, and today we will be tackling hate speech and loosening restrictions on speech. Should speech be regulated? Should the status quo be maintained? Or should the regulations on speech be eliminated entirely? Today, I'm going to attempt to argue in the defense of eliminating regulations on speech. For those that know me already, I'm a libertarian. I don't support government regulations on any individual rights. So this really shouldn't be too much of a shock to most of my viewers. But without all these informalities in the way, let's get into it. Now let's talk a brief overview of what hate speech is. Hate speech is, by definition, any communication in speech, writing, or behavior that aggressively targets or threatens, insults individuals or groups based off of attributes such as race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. This was from Martyr from the University of Calgary. Let's first start with the conservative perspective. They would argue that protecting free speech, including hate speech, is often seen as a commitment to the principle that individuals have the right to express their opinions, even if those opinions are offensive or unpopular. It upholds the idea that the government should not be in the business of determining what values and views are acceptable. And once restrictions are placed on certain types of speech, it creates a little bit of a slippery slope where governments or authorities might expand on those restrictions to suppress other forms of expression. Protecting even unpopular or offensive speech can serve as a safeguard against potential abuses of power in our government, as well as what actually defines hate speech can also be subjective and also prone to interpretation and emotion. Allowing for diverse perspectives, even those deemed offensive by some, avoids the risk of stifling legitimate, if not valid, controversial opinions by relying on clear and objective criteria and evidence. From a feminist perspective, advocates may argue in the defense of free speech, emphasizing that a woman's speech should be protected at all costs. Women who have historically experienced limited access to the same free speech as men may assert that in the past, their expressions against men or societal norms were also labeled as hate speech as well. And when they spoke out against a man or the established system, their pleas for assistance were often treated as disruptive and contradictory to social norms. Consequently, they were also frequently subjugated to abuse or ridicule by both society and their peers for that said speech. And so it's important that we maintain this speech so we do not go back to that way of thinking. Some feminists argue that this remains an ongoing issue. While feminists in Western nations have gained access to free speech and generally the same rights as men, in Eastern nations or jihadist nations, women still face the same subjugation and ridicule that they did 100 years ago here in Western nations. The fight continues, particularly in nations where women lack protection in free speech. Speaking out against society or men in such contexts may lead to severe consequences for women, including execution as fast as someone may blink in most of these contexts. From a communitarian perspective, they might also emphasize the importance of communities having the autonomy to govern themselves. Loosening restrictions on speech could be seen as respecting the ability of these said communities to address their own issues locally and determine their own standards for what is acceptable discourse. They might also advocate for a compromise, such as loosening restrictions on speech in exchange for safeguarding individuals from potential consequences that may follow after speech. This could involve protection from violence or in the event that a person tries to walk away from an argument, ensuring the safety of the individual by protecting them if someone tries to chase after them after the discourse is already finished, or if the person decides that they no longer wish to continue this conversation because they're uncomfortable or they do not like the speech that is being shoved to them. I hope I provided everyone with an in-depth explanation of the ideologies and opinions that may support loosening restrictions on speech. It should be noted that with this argument, I do not endorse violence of any kind or hatred against my fellow man. My desire is for a world where we can be free from government intervention on individual rights. Viva la libertad!